participating actively in the different sessions on Tuesday 17th and yesterday 18th August, and then for logging in today. Today's moderators, Eric, I think he's somewhere in the US, and he's going to be supported by Dennis right here in this room in Nairobi. In the interest of time, I will be asking Eric to start together with Dennis and introduce the different speakers. But colleagues, as you'll be informed as we go along, we'll have this session, then move to parallel sessions for other presentations. This session will run for close to 2 hours, then another session for nearly 50 minutes. Then we'll get back plenary at 6 p.m., 3 hours for now, for the general closing session. I urge you and ask you to stick in there so that we move together until the very end of this conference. Thank you so much. I now invite Eric to take lead and invite other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of the panelists and the audience. Thank you for the opportunity to moderate this session on day 3 of the RCMRD International Conference. Welcome again. I'm Eric Anderson, the Associate Chief Scientist with the Surveyor Program. I'm based at the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm pleased to welcome you all back to the RIC on day 3 for this session on innovations in resilience building, climate mitigation, and adaptation strategies. We have 3 esteemed panelists today speaking on a range of climate adaptation and mitigation topics. Our first speaker will be Dr. David Obura from Cordillo, East Africa. Dr. Obura is the director of Cordillo, East Africa, based in Mombasa, Kenya. Cordillo focuses on coastal and marine topics with a particular interest in coastal reefs, fisheries, and coastal livelihoods. Followed by Dr. Obura, we're pleased to welcome Mr. Martin Mulungo from the USAID Kenya and East Africa mission in Nairobi, Kenya. Mr. Mulungo is a water and sanitation specialist with USAID. Our third speaker is Dr. Halima Sado Abdullahi. Dr. Abdullahi is the head of research and learning at the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs at the Kenya Red Cross Society. Without further ado, well, let me give you a little bit of logistics. Each of the speakers will have about 30 minutes to present. Please feel free to share your questions, and we will organize the questions to do a Q&A, a synthesis discussion after the 3 presenters have an opportunity to provide their presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. David Obura from Cordillo, East Africa, to share his presentation on climate change, adaptation, mitigation in the coastal and marine sector.
Thank you very much, Eric, and good afternoon, good morning to all on the conference. It's a pleasure to be with you here now. I'd like to thank RCMRD for inviting me to participate in this conference as a keynote speaker. It's an honor to be able to do so. And I've been asked to reflect a bit on the theme of resilience building in relation to climate adaptation and mitigation. I work on coral reefs. My organization, Cordillo, is based in Mombasa, and we work on East African or Western Indian Ocean coral reefs. And what I'll do is I'll try and go through a range of issues, starting with the coastal and marine sector, as I've been asked to do over here, but ending with general principles that relate across to terrestrial spaces as well. So over the 30 minutes that I have, I'll cover these 5 main topics. So sea level rise and coastal vulnerability. This is an area we're starting to get into, and I think is perhaps more familiar to many participating in the conference from an Earth observation perspective. We work primarily on coral reefs and climate vulnerability for the last 20 years, and I'll summarize that briefly. And then from that basis, what we are trying to do as a research organization is invest a lot more in how we can use and make our data more open and accessible and support decision-making much more effectively, whether this is at national or local government levels, or else at regional and international levels as well. We try and do this framing our data strongly in societal relevance. So I'll go into that, very much framed around the Sustainable Development Goals. And then right now, a key issue that we're dealing with is integrating targets in relation to the SDGs, of course, but at the moment, the Convention on Biological Diversity is of very high relevance to us in our work with the discussions on the targets underway right now. So I'll attempt to go through all of that. And as I go through these, I'll try and relate what may be a little bit unfamiliar to many on the call in the coastal marine sector to what you work with Earth observation data. So this is work that we've just started to do in Cordillo over the last few years, but it's not our primary expertise. And James Mbugwa in my office has been working on this and looking at shoreline change and the sea level rise and the risk of sea level rise in the future. So here we have started a fairly standard look at shoreline change data. Here, this is Mombasa, the north coast of Mombasa, and Nyali and Bamburi. On the left, you can see the coastlines in 1973 and 2014. And on the right, an inset in which we've looked at calculating the distance, the rate of change of sea level rise of the coastline over that time. You can see that there's quite high variation in the calculated rate of change from the colors from blue, dark and light blues with relatively low distance of change to red, quite a high distance of change. Of course, the resolution of the 1973 shoreline is fairly poor. So these numbers are not perhaps a bit too precise to be usable because of their variation from point to point on the coastline. Coastline is quite smooth. But taking a step back from this, we have been looking at future sea level rise and shoreline change, and so and attempting to write up this information, not so much in scientific publications yet, but much more in terms of policy relevance to the city of Mombasa. This is an example of an article we did with the South African Institute for International Affairs early last year. And the map shows in different colors using a high resolution digital elevation model, the vulnerability of Mombasa's coastline to sea level rise. So in blues, you can see on the scale at right, and perhaps I'll just narrow in on part of the coastline. In blues, the tidal range in Mombasa goes from 0 to 4 meters of height. So these are areas that are part of the shoreline anyway. And then in red colors, we've indicated risks of 1, 2, and 3 meter rise of sea level. So that's 5, 6, 7 meters above current zero tide. And then in greens, lower risk, and moving to high elevation areas that are not at risk. But you can see that in the reds, it's a narrow fringe around the coastline. Mombasa is a relatively high coastline with coastal cliffs, but a high vulnerability zone. I think if you can see my cursor in this area where the coastline is relatively low and there's high density of development there. There's a lot of apartments, houses, and also coastal tourism. This is a big focus for development there. So looking a little bit more at how this can be used in local government or in the municipal or city government for decision making. We're trying to classify this into these five or six classes of risk levels from very high to no risk. And then looking at, various statistics in relation to that, the percent of that exposed area in terms of the area of Mombasa, that's relatively evenly spread across these various categories. But then the percentage of population is higher in the high risk zone for sea level rise. So this is probably looking at actions that may not be needed for another 40 to 100 years, depending on sea level rise, but decisions that have to be considered by developers in when they actually develop. And then in the lower graph on the bottom right, the population trend using digital models of population density across the city, and how that has increased over the last few years. And of course, projecting these into the future will be of interest. And now we're sort of trying to get into discussions with Mombasa County about how better to use and apply this sort of information in the sorts of decision making that they will want to do. Turning to coral reefs and climate vulnerability, we are coral reef ecologists as our foundations. We have been working on coral reef monitoring since Cordillo started over 20 years ago in 1999, and that was after the first global bleaching event that East Africa experienced, and coral reefs around the world. But in East Africa, we had massive rains during a strong El Nino in that year, in 97 into 98. And this provides quite a good indication of the link to the Earth observation community of the sort of ecological work that we do in looking at ecosystem health and how that impacts on reef users. So on the right are the networks, the global networks that we are engaged in terms of doing coral reef monitoring. So the International Coral Reef Initiative and the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, the the International Coral Reef Society of Scientists, but then also in the conservation world through the IUCN and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We're very active in the region, and various marine programs, and many partners and countries are, as well as in the Coral Specialist Group in trying to improve conservation actions on coral reefs. Now, these are the community that we work with on the ground, but in relation to Earth observation, the GEO, the Biodiversity Observation Network, GEOBON, has a strong focus or on marine aspects as well, including coral reefs. I've been very active in GOOSE, in the Global Ocean Observing System, and then in sharing data through the IODE and OBIS of UNESCO. Now, the link, between the remote sensing community and the in situ scientific community is really through these essential ocean variables or essential biodiversity variables. For ocean variables, we've worked a bit more through GOOSE than GEOBON or MBON in terms of identifying EOVs. And live coral or hard coral cover and composition has been one of the principal essential ocean variables that's been applied globally for over 20 years now and is used in remote sensing as well as in situ fieldwork. And we've been trying to link the two sectors together quite strongly through this EOV. And we're updating the description of the variable now because it's fairly clear in the discussions now in the global processes under the Convention on Biological Diversity that, there's still some improvements to make in standardizing this variable for measurement around the world in a consistent way and for how it can be used under various decision-making processes. We have really worked a lot in the region through this global coral reef monitoring network. In 2017, the 10 countries in the Nairobi Convention region came together and put out this regional report on the left, which we have helped to coordinate and facilitate as Cordillo. The funding has generally come from external sources such as the Indian Ocean Commission, sometime from UNEP as well in prior years, through the ICRI networks. Right now, or in the next month or so, a global status of coral reefs of the world report will be published, and then we will put out an update for our region, for the Western Indian Ocean, on the basis of this global report. So about probably 5 years after this report was done in 2017. And we really target now having, through the GCRMN network, having these 5-year assessment report updates so that countries can be updated and regional conventions can be updated on the status of reefs and what to do about them. So I'll give a quick overview of the results that we get from doing this. In the 2017 report, this was our main summary graph of the percent cover on coral reefs of hard coral in blue and of fleshy algae in green. You can see the error bars around those lines. And you can see quite clearly in 97, 98, the decline in coral cover because of that first global coral bleaching event, the massive El Nino, which coincided with a positive Indian Ocean dipole and the warmest year on record globally. As the coral cover declined, the cover of fleshy algae went up, the algae settling on the dead coral, and then both remained stable for about almost 20 years up to 2016, when we had the second largest coral bleaching event in the region after the one in 1998. We haven't compiled the data since then, but first let me mention in these regional reports, we of course put out information on the status of reefs at the national level. So this is the summary across the countries that we had adequate data for from the region. Of course, you can see it's quite variable amongst the countries, and this relates to the different condition of reefs within those countries, of course, but also to the amount of data available. And there's some countries have much larger data gaps than others. And this is an area that's in our networks, I think, as you do within the remote sensing community with the RCMRD, as we try and fill these gaps and to build capacity so that we can have complementary data across all countries as we move forward. This also just shows you the focused monitoring we do on coral bleaching events. Now, coral bleaching is what happens when temperatures in the water are too warm and corals are stressed and start to die off. They turn from this normal color to white. They can see through the tissue when they're stressed, and then they die. We have set up the citizen science online tool. You can see here that it's been running from 2016. We haven't shown here the data for 2021. It shows the type of reporting and the degree of bleaching that we're having, that observers are reporting from around the Western Indian Ocean. So we can see in 2016 the amount of bleaching first and mortality that occurred in 2016. And we had quite large amounts of bleaching. This is a summary illustration down below. Almost 50% of sites showed high or extreme bleaching in these red colors. But there was a lot of recovery, and fortunately only sort of 15% of sites showed high to extreme mortality of the corals after the bleaching. So many of the corals recovered. This is a bit an indication of the weaker corals having been weeded out in the 98 event and some other events since then, but some adaptation and acclimatization of corals to warming conditions. So the question that we have now in looking forward with reefs is that we've seen a clear decline in coral cover from pre-1998 to the period from 99 to 2016. And we've seen a further decline after 2016, so post-2017. And what was clear was that in this 20-year period, the coral reefs didn't recover to pre-bleaching conditions. They remained fairly stable, partly because of other threats that they're experiencing. So we're wondering if there's going to be another step decline, and will the coral reefs recover from the bleaching and mortality in 2016, or will they remain relatively stable until the next, the next climate threat appears, which it certainly will, as reefs will bleach many times in the coming decades because of increased warming. The other trend we've observed is the main thing I'll just point out here is that this is the population, the biomass of fish on coral reefs, and we've seen from 2000 up to 2016 that this brown line shows the biomass. So the green line is herbivores. So this is the fish that eat algae on a reef have been increasing in biomass since the bleaching event in 98 up until recently. And this may reflect the increased food that they have and this increased algae that is present on the reefs instead of coral. And so we're concerned that, and other fish have been declining in that period. So we're concerned that this means a lower resilience of corals and a shift to an algal herbivory system on coral reefs, to algae reefs and rocky reefs. They may still be very productive in terms of fisheries because of the herbivore communities on them, but they may not be fully functioning reef systems into the future. So then the question is, what can we do with this data, and trying to improve our delivery of this data into decision-making processes. Now, we've had this regional network for over 20 years now, and now with the online data sharing and analysis tools, there's much greater opportunity to be able to share data effectively. So we have just run this online course for 2 months, which finished at the beginning of this month in August. And this is for the community of coral reef scientists and those collecting monitoring data to manage their data more effectively, to share it amongst us more efficiently, and then to be able to report from that data repository, whether it's for national or local or regional purposes. You know, this could be determined by the users of the system and those who contribute their data. So this is just a shot of the wiki. We ran this project in GitHub using R code and for analyses. And it's been set up as an online wiki so that we can also repeat presentation of this training course in the future, but also it can be applied by other coral reef regions around the world. So we're hoping that from the West Indian Ocean, we can make this available to others as well. Just some statistics from the course. It was funded by WIOMSA, the West Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, and their Marine Science for Management program. There was great interest. We had 102 applicants, 45 were shortlisted, but only 16 were able to finalize the course. It's quite grueling. We had 25 live sessions over the course of the 2 months of lectures, worked examples, homework exercises, and so on. But we now have a core from this group of 12 who finished the course. We may end up with 6 or 8 who could be core participants with Cordillo staff who helped deliver the course with a consultant. Hopefully they can be a core group of data analysts that we can use to strengthen our regional network. This just shows the main GitHub page, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. And down we had the menu for the course, the list of each item of content. So for example, a template reporting system for using R Markdown once the results are available, for visualizing spatial monitoring data. So we have all these pages are now established. We'll go through an assessment of how well the course works, and then we'll come up with a more, I suppose, refined course that we can deliver again in the region to consolidate our work here, but then also make available to other regions as well. So in using the data for decision-making, one of the areas we've focused on as Cordillo for the last 2 or 3 years is to use this monitoring data from reefs to undertake a red list of ecosystems for coral reefs of the West Indian Ocean. This is an indicator system or a framework for assessing the conservation status of ecosystems developed by the IUCN, building on the red list of species. It identifies a unified standard of risk of collapse. So from ecosystems that are least concerned through near threatened to these threatened categories, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, and to collapsed. And it can be applied from subnational to global levels. So we have a project funded by NORAD at the moment, and we conducted this analysis through this project. The results are in review in Nature Sustainability, so I can't show you the full results now, but basically we found that all of these ecoregions, so each of the units we assessed as identified in the map over here, all of these were either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, and the whole region was vulnerable to collapse. So this is a worrying result, of course. There was greatest threat from future warming and a lesser threat from fishing impacts. The good news is the impact of past bleaching events was somewhat masked by some levels of recovery, but we were not able to assess all aspects of the reef ecology, such as coral composition and other things like that. So we are now going into nationally more higher resolution analyses within national frameworks and within national policy processes so that we can use this information to support national decision-making or even local governments or protected area decision-making to improve resilience and to support sustainability of these coral reefs. So then we come to the societal relevance of our environmental data. Now we work on coral reefs, and it's quite clear, working on a coral reef or a pastoralist ecosystem, for example, that there is a very high dependence of people on these ecosystems, whether for fishing or for their livestock, for example. And so I think in these systems, it's relatively clear. But more broadly than that, in farming ecosystems or in highly transformed ecosystems, I think it becomes less clear, it becomes harder to communicate how important environmental information is or how important the state of nature is for people's resilience and adaptive capacity to change, for their livelihoods, for the economies. And so what we've tried to do to generalize from our work is to really build more general models or narratives around sustainable development. So this is a narrative model that we worked on and published last year using the Sustainable Development Goals. And really what it does is we try to show how these environmental SDGs, so 13, 14, and 15 are clearly nature SDGs. 13 is climate, 14 is the ocean, 15 is life on land. 6 is freshwater, which in the SDGs is more about human use of freshwater, but it can also be used for freshwater ecosystems, But these nature SDGs support the sort of direct benefit SDGs. So jobs in number 8, sustainable consumption and production in number 12, coastal communities or cities and settlements in number 11, and so on. And this direct benefits from nature really support indirect benefits of welfare. So of reducing poverty, of improving food security, improving health, and then also the gender and equality SDGs in 5 and 10 as well. And that the SDGs around knowledge or education in 4, and then governance and partnerships in 16 and 17 are really needed to bring all of these together. So we felt that the SDGs, while they are developed at national and international levels, they can really build a picture of local dependence on nature, a local narrative of how people depend on nature. Now, I've also just written an article in this website on the right, this current conservation, that's hopefully coming out in the next few days, that really helps make this more tangible. I have a complex figure over here, but I think I won't have time to go through all of the steps with you now in person. But basically, it starts with the story of a Hamisi and Mariam, or a fishing family on the coast of Kenya. Their livelihood depends on the reef. And you can identify the SDGs that relate to each of the components of this local landscape or seascape. So their livelihoods and benefits, the reef itself in number 14, how the reef is managed through the beach management units and perhaps a local protected area, and that would be under governance in SDG 16. There are aspects of health and gender equality involved in this system. There's tourism development, and that affects land use in SDG 15, water quality in SDG 6, and so on. There are local tourism operators and other partners with interest in the reef system that all relate to each other. We have a issue on the right here under education, and as capacity is built in the local community and diversification of income. There's a climate and energy component to the story. There's a governance element in local government and national governments that regulates all of these aspects of the local system. And then there's equity, how these benefits are shared amongst people. So the article coming out of this website, sort of develops this in a much more artistic and sort of user-friendly way. And we hope that we can use this narrative article to really help communicate the social relevance of the environmental data and how we need information and data to support decision-making. So for example, in looking at fisheries in the past, we would look at direct benefits, measure fish catch. But with an SDG model, we also look at the health of the reef system that the fish comes from, and as well as the number of jobs and the economy that depends on the fishing. But even more than that, there are indirect benefits that are derived from the fishing across a couple of different or many different SDGs. There's also a range of enabling factors from the environment, climate, clean water, and coastal land use, as well as the means of implementation and the governance, and the education and knowledge and the partnerships that surround the fishery. So it's possible with the SDGs to develop a much broader picture of how the environment supports economy, people, and society, and make sure that there are no negatives in all of this. If we can have indicators across all of these, we can assure that impacts are minimized and that activities don't harm the interests of different stakeholder groups in the system. So rather than a narrow focus on marine protection and fisheries, for example, this is really a sustainable use perspective that enables us to look across all of the SDGs on tangible materials from nature and benefits to people, so we can sustain them and optimize the benefits that are obtained. The SDG model helps facilitate this, and we've learned a lot about this in the last year and a half with the COVID pandemic, with a perspective on One Health. And the SDG model like this should help really ensure that decisions made from one perspective are mutually supportive with decisions from another perspective rather than in conflict with one another. So I'll finish now in just the last minutes I have on how to integrate targets. This is very complex if we're trying to integrate all these targets across many different sectors. And this is coming to the theme of the conference on building resilience. So how do we work from one perspective, such as Earth observation or coral reef science? How can we make sure that we're meeting SDG targets? And then, as I said, right now in the Convention on Biological Diversity, we're really focused on biodiversity targets that are being negotiated, with a meeting next week, in fact, starting on 23rd of August, the last of 3 open-ended working group meetings hosted by the convention. And for this, I'm afraid I'll have to race through this to not take up too much time. But this is a paper which a group of African authors developed. It came out in Science Journal last Friday, where we really wanted to look holistically across the objectives of the convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework and multiple targets. The premise for this is that the global condition of nature varies from pristine on the left of these bar graphs to highly impacted on the right and transformed in these anthromes or anthropogenically altered biomes. And rather than focusing conservation in the best spaces, which is what conservation has tended to do, we need to focus on sustainability across all spaces. And this is where the work that many of you do, I think, with Earth observation data is critical, because you look at landscape features and how land use varies across all of country space rather than just in the best. So this is where we have been with the conservation to date under HE Target 11, in which the best areas for conservation were prioritized. The target was for 17% of land to be under protection, and it was achieved in 2020. Now we're supposed to go up to a target of 30% by 2030. And so I'm just adding that additional 13% in blue there in the land under the best condition. But there's a lot of concerns about effectiveness of management in existing protected areas, about equity and how protected areas have been put in place in relation to indigenous people and local communities. And what about people living across land that is degraded? Shouldn't conservation also support their needs as well and their dependence on nature? So our framework, we've called it this shared earth, shared ocean approach. It takes this 17% of protection as a baseline from 2020, but instead of adding up to 30% in the gray bars, we propose to spread it across these shared spaces and including to cities over here. There's 4 key pillars. One is to focus at the local scale and to focus on equity and people, because the interests of people have generally not been the priority in conservation action, and that needs to change. And especially African countries and others, developing countries, are really adamant about that now, which is appropriate. So We need to apply knowledge at this scale, and that means we can use local and traditional knowledge as well as science downscaled to this level. And of course, Earth observation data is perfect for doing this and really enables this, and to address all relevant GBF targets together. There's a recent result that says that 20% of intact nature in all spaces can meet biodiversity conservation targets and assure benefits to people, which is a key result that we rely on, because that enables spreading spreading conservation across all spaces to meet the total 30% target. Now, let me just show two policy options that we hope to support with doing this as well, and shows the integration across all the targets. So in the new framework, target 3 is for 30% protection. If we address target 21 as well about equitable and effective participation of all people, we can make sure that that conservation across all of these spaces is done with representation and participation by Indigenous people and local communities, by youth, by women. So it's fully inclusive. And so the way protection is done doesn't have to be the same across all of these spaces. The same with the restoration target, which has been identified for 20% restoration of ecosystems. Of course, the degree of restoration needed will change across the x-axis, with more restoration being needed in more impacted places. And so again, we can address multiple targets together using this framework that we propose. So the idea here is that using this shared Earth framework across all these 21 targets of the new global biodiversity framework through local government levels, such as here the counties in Kenya, we can assure inclusion as well as provide the necessary locus for mobilization of resources to fund this conservation that needs to happen. And of course, the role of Earth observation is key in facilitating this global and national to local information transfer in a way that can adequately address the decisions that need to be made. So this is my final slide. I'll finish with this integrating slide just to show how, in relation to the topic that I was set, looking at climate change adaptation and mitigation in the coastal and marine sector, I've come away from that in the final, because I think the principles are the same across land and sea and reflecting on resilience. So we started working on coral reefs, but then looking more broadly at a coastal landscape with the fishing communities and the tourism that are centered around those. We've taken an SDG framework to look holistically at all the different needs that affect that landscape. And then in thinking about the new global biodiversity framework, this model of a shared Earth, shared ocean can help to translate or help to link all of these targets together across that local landscape and through local government frameworks. And so in thinking about what to do next, how to move forward, these are some key bullet points about the need for local focus on sustainability, looking at nature as the key assets. The issue of equity of access and benefits is critical across land, fresh water, and ocean applications. The key thing that lower and middle income countries need more capacity, and that needs to be supported to improve data access and use, and that all of this work needs to be policy relevant and across scales from global to local. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful perspectives from the coastal and marine sector, Dr. Obura. We will organize questions for the synthesis at the end of the three presentations. Thank you again. I'd now like to invite Mr. Martin Mulongo from USAID Kenya and East Africa for his presentation.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This moment, great to join you in in this conference that has been going on for the last 3 days, and specifically to share about climate resilience development in the water sector. And I'm not trying to, let me try to see if I can put on my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
It looks like there may be a bit of a delay. And for bandwidth, Mr. Malongo, I wonder if you could turn off your video. That might help. You're coming in a bit, you're breaking up a bit.
Okay, just a moment.
I'm wondering if we can offer to project the slides from the organizer side.
Yeah, Eric, I think this will be the most efficient option, so we don't take a lot of time.
Okay, and thank you, Dennis. And Mr. Malongo, we've lost the connection with you. Can you still hear me?
It looks like he's dropped, actually. Perhaps we can have our secretary here reach out to him, and we can possibly shift him to the last presentation so we can have Dr. Sando. Yeah, sure. All right. I think, Eric, we can move to
Okay.
Dr. Halima, and one of our secretary members will contact Mr. Mlongo to present at the end, if that is okay.
That's a good alternative. Thank you so much. Dr. Halima, we're pleased to pass the stage over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon. I hope I'm audible and my screen is clear. You're able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and we hear you very well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. So, yeah, so I'll be presenting some of the works that Kenya Red Cross is implementing in partnership with a number of organizations, both locally and globally. And as you see from my first slide, you can see on the left side, there's a path. And I think I was trying to link this picture to the theme of this particular conference, which is on reflecting on resilience. And it's just important for us to remind ourselves that resilience is a journey that starts with one step. And of course, as you travel along the journey, there are a number of things that or a number of factors that will be coming along the way to try and take you away from the path. And I think for today's perspectives, we're going to look at impacts of climate change and climate variability towards our efforts in building and enhancing resilience, specifically for our most vulnerable communities. So if I just take a step back, just to kind of remind ourselves what is happening globally and also locally with regards to weather and climate-related disasters, we can see that in the last decade, of course, from 2010 to 2019, there's been an increase of climate and weather-related disasters with an increase of 9%. And then as we compare to the previous years of 2001 to 2010, and even higher by 14% with respect to the year 1991 to 2000. That is a clear indication that as we increase our efforts towards being resilient, of course, we are trying to battle with impacts of climate change and climate variability. And with regards to this, you can imagine that what is happening, especially in this part of the world, where we have higher impacts of these particular extreme events, And recently, we've had people being affected into millions, vis-a-vis in the years 1975 to 1985, where people are being affected in thousands. So climate change is increasing in frequency and in intensity, and it's really impacting on, especially for this part of the world and Kenya specifically. Climate change is impacting, and it's highlighting or reflecting or showcasing itself with regards to floods and droughts, more specifically, and impacting more on the most vulnerable community. And because this occurrence is evident and we cannot run away from it, we are living in the times of climate change. It's really affecting the human lives, the livelihoods, the properties, the development gains as we try to achieve our sustainable development goals, our Vision 2030 as Kenya, and many other development agenda that we want to achieve as a country as well as globally. And more importantly, with respect to this particular thematic discussions we're having in this particular conference, of course, is strengthening the resilient efforts that we are undertaking in our respective institutions and organizations locally and globally. So just to take back in terms of just what do we mean that this, or how do we come to say that there's increase in variability of this particular and frequency of this particular event. If we take floods, for example, and we take Kenya as an example as well, you can see that in 2018, we experienced floods, and not just in small quantities, but in high magnitude. We also experienced floods in 2019. We also experienced floods in 2020. And of course, we also experienced floods in 2021. I don't have a picture of that, but yes, we've been responding to floods in parts of the country, and especially in the western part of the country. And this is a clear indication, as much as we are moving towards being a resilient community, the extreme events are actually taking back our efforts in terms of ensuring that we enhance the resilience of the most vulnerable communities towards impacts of climate change and other related disasters. So that is what we are actually foreseeing now. So then, of course, for every challenge, there's always an opportunity, depending on how you want to look at it. And I think a decision was made a number of years ago within the humanitarian sector, but also the development sector as well as government, on moving away from a reactive approach to disaster management, and more specifically a reactive humanitarian financing or giving money when things are already hot. And if you look from this picture, you can see where the help is coming. We're already burning, and that's where help is coming. However, we can actually do much more, and we don't have to actually wait when things are very bad, so that we can actually support those who need our help. So as the frequency of climate change increases in terms of intensity, and of course the impacts, there are a number of we can call it innovative, or we can call it a number of the new ways, or enhancing the older ways of actually addressing these particular issues. And specifically, how do we go about enhancing our early warning systems so that we can become a critical component of disaster risk reduction. If we make reference to the Sendai framework, we had moved from the disaster management to disaster risk reduction. How can we reduce the risks actually, so that we can actually cushion the most vulnerable in terms of their lives, livelihoods, as well as development gain. So it is important for us to note there are possibility that we can actually use early warning information, and especially weather and climate related information, to anticipate what is coming, anticipate the disaster, be able to implement action within this anticipatory period, to be able to prevent, and if possible, reduce human suffering and losses. And I think if we really want to really stay on the path of resilience, it will be important for us to be aware of what is coming and be able to cushion our development, lives, and livelihoods. So then again, as we've agreed that previously, that of course the climate change will lead to changes in frequency, will also lead change into intensity, the spatial extent, the duration, and the timing. And if you look at the scenarios we are experiencing now, when we are supposed to have rains, we're not having rains, and when it comes in a specific day, heavy rains, or it takes longer to come. So the intensity, the frequency, when it's supposed to happen, the timing, we seem not to be getting it right because of course, the climate change and climate variability. But again, as I said, there's always an opportunity. And when you look at about issues around climate risk planning, The only way you can plan about something is to know what is happening, what is coming, and to be better deal with this, you'll be able first to understand what is coming, and more importantly, to understand the emerging risks. So what is new, in addition to what we know, what else is new that might be coming our way? And how can we actually simulate access to monitoring what is coming, and also sharing effective early warning information to the relevant stakeholders? How can we take advantage of this to enhance preparedness and response capacity? And more importantly, how can we work around investing in anticipatory approaches, prediction or predictive analysis, and be able to take actions well in advance? And more specifically, then how do we enable, how do you create an enabling environment to ensure that we're able to sustain this way of doing business, and more specifically to ensure that there's always funds to take action when it's needed. So I will briefly take you through what we are calling end-to-end early warning system. I know we've been speaking about early warning system for the longest time in many parts of the world. But then in detail, what do we mean and what do we really want to attain, and who is supposed to be a member of this or to be part of this early warning system? So we have 4 main components that we really emphasize when it comes to an end-to-end early warning system. And one of the components is actually knowledge of the risk. For you to be able to prepare, for you to be able to anticipate, for you to be able to actually plan your investment, plan your resilience initiative, you really have to know, what is at risk, what are your threats, what is your, what can actually interfere with your investment, what can interfere with your decision. So knowledge of risk is very critical and it's very important. It is important to know who and what is most exposed to and vulnerable to weather and climate-related hazard and where. And this knowledge is not only meant for the decision makers or the practitioners, it's also important for the communities to actually be aware and be what is coming, to be aware how are they at risk, what is at risk, what is the risk they're supposed to be dealing or anticipating. So this particular knowledge should cut across all levels, And if I give an example of how we are doing it here is we try to ensure that this knowledge is at the ward level where we're establishing community and disaster risk reduction committees, whereby these communities are taken through different capacity development, because they're also aware, they live within this particular ecosystem and they know where the problem is, and it's important that they have this knowledge. But then it also goes up to the ward, to the sub-county, county, the national level, and all other critical stakeholders. It's important for us to have that knowledge. Then when we have the knowledge, then what are we supposed to do? Of course, we need to follow up and warn people when something is coming. So of course, development of monitoring and early warning services, we can leverage on the scientific focus that we receive, but we can also leverage on indigenous way of doing things. And that's why this capacity of having knowledge of risk, it's important also at the community level. If the community are aware of what is at risk and they're able to use their focusing system to know what is coming so that they can anticipate what is coming in terms of risk and impact, then they'll be able to be prepared better in terms of dealing with these particular challenges. So then, so once you are aware of what is coming, you know what the risk look like, you know how it's going to impact on you. It's very important, of course, to communicate. So communication of the information about risk and early warning, it's critical. How do we disseminate this communication? How do we communicate? How do we ensure that the relevant stakeholders across the different levels are able to get this information on time? And what kind of information are they getting? Are they getting information that is actionable, they can do something about it? Or it's just information for the sake of knowing that something is happening, but I don't know what to do about it. So information that will enable an action, and more importantly, an effective action towards what is coming, either with respect to the risk or the impacts. Then more importantly is, of course, once you get all this, then you need to, align appropriate actions to reduce human sufferings, to reduce loss, to reduce economic losses, to protect the development gains, to be able to actually to say that we are actually on the resilient path as we move forward. However, this cannot happen, just in a vacuum. It has to happen in an enabling environment, and critically, of course, we have to have, the legislations, the policy, the frameworks to ensure that we are able to actually operationalize this early warning, early action system that we're talking about, ensuring that they're anchored in law, they're anchored in policy, we have the capacities, we have the structures in place to enable us actually ensure that we are saying we have an effective end-to-end early warning, early action system. So if I narrow down to now one of the innovative approaches that we are undertaking within the movement, but not just within the Red Cross movement, but also within a number of critical stakeholders, including development partners and governments, is what we call the anticipatory action. And of course, this is anchored on the scientific progress, especially the climate science that has really improved, and it's possible for us to predict with increasing precision where there's a risk of climate and weather-related hazard, and the kind of impact, and what we call impact-based forecasting. Yes, we know what this is, what is happening. We're going to have above normal rainfall, but then what does that mean? What will happen? Are we going to get it? Are we going to experience flooding? Are we going to experience displacement and stuff like that? And because of this, then we are able to give us time to act before a hazard turns into a disaster. So it is important for us, if we really want to sustain our resilience initiatives, our resilience effort, we have to ensure that whatever is coming our way doesn't turn into a disaster, because it takes us back to an emergency mode, to a response mode, and we have to deal with that aspect before we embark back on our resilience journey and also on our development journey. So what we'd like to take advantage of in terms of the anticipatory action is something we call the window of opportunity. And so that we're able, if you remember my previous slide, help was coming towards the end. Is it possible for us, for the help to come within the window of opportunity? That is when a forecast is released, early when information is sent, and we know this is coming our way. Are we able to take actions, especially low action, but with high impact before actually the disaster happens? So that is what we are trying to actually advocate as we move forward. This particular piece of work actually started a number of years ago within the Red Cross movement, but also institutions like WFP, the World Food Programme, has been in the forefront of making use of this technical improvement to develop what we call focus-based financing system that I will elaborate further on the next slide, which is an innovative funding system in terms of responding to especially extreme weather and climate-related events. Other institutions that have come on board with this particular kind of doing business is, of course, the START Network, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and more recently, the UN OCHA has a funding, a similar funding instrument in terms of pushing and highlighting and upscaling anticipatory approach to disaster management. So moreover, then the emerging anticipation agenda has sparked a lot of investment, not just within the humanitarian sector as we speak, but a lot of investment has gone to the meteorological department and climate services providers, research and predictive analytics, governance and capacity development building worldwide, and stimulating across cross-organization collaboration beyond the humanitarian sector. And if I give an example, currently in Kenya, Kenya Red Cross, in partnership with stakeholders, both from government and development partners, we are actually in the process of developing anticipatory system for floods and drought for Kenya. And this is being led by a national technical working group that was established in 2019. So you can see it cannot be done alone. We have academia, we have people who are in charge of analytics, we have the Met department that gives us the forecast and stuff like that. So, of course, we have to work with credible warnings, because once you put money, people don't want to actually, every time to act in vain. So we have to also continue investing in ensuring that the skill of forecast is improving every single day. So if I dive into the focus-based financing instrument or innovative approach in terms of disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, or resilience building. So it is an anticipatory approach which funding is automatically allocated when critical forecast thresholds are reached, so that pre-agreed actions can be taken before the shock. So we have to develop a system, what we are calling early action protocol, to be able to agree on the thresholds and pre-agreed triggers, and also pre-agreed actions that once we get into that threshold, then we can trigger the system and access funds within the window of opportunity to be able to take actions so that we can reduce the impacts and, if possible, even prevent. So it is important that we first design scenarios to analyze the risks. So yeah, and then of course, looking at what has happened in the past, historical impact, and of course the level of vulnerability, because as much as we're experiencing extreme or impacts of climate change, all of us are not being impacted the same. So it's very important to know the vulnerability levels, who is vulnerable, how vulnerable are they, where are they, and stuff like that. So after that, we formulate what we call early actions, or we can call them anticipatory action or focus-based action, depending on how you want to look at it, but they're all more or less the same things. By creating awareness on a number of things, for example, if we're expecting something that will lead to a sanitation problem, can we say maybe we anticipate sanitation awareness creation and stuff like that. But it's very important that we define the threshold of a specific hazard, and that's why we have to work with across the different areas of expertise, so that we're able to be very comfortable when you're triggering these systems in terms of undertaking anticipatory, or what we call early warning, early actions. So as we move towards advocating and upscaling or scaling up anticipatory action, it's important to mainstream this particular kind of approach across a number of partners or a number of institutions. And just before I go back to the mainstreaming, it is important that we know that these different actors, especially in Kenya, who are part of the technical working group, have been given the powers actually to validate this particular early action protocol that we are developing, or what we can call, standard operating procedures, so that we can all own the system. We have to simulate it to ensure that how are we coordinating each other, and to be able to ensure that the early actions that we are proposing or prioritizing actually give us the impacts that we are looking for. So in terms of availability of this kind of funding, so far, as I indicated, we have funding from the Red Crescent Movement, the IFRC. We also have a funding instrument that WFP is actually providing with regards to anticipatory action. We have funding from Start Network, and we also have funding from UN OCHA, as well as FAO. So for us to be able to unleash the full potential and ensure that most people in high risk contexts can receive assistance ahead of predictable shocks, several initiatives have been launched to mainstream anticipatory actions across frameworks and sectors. They include the Anticipatory Action Task Force, which has been formed to encourage dialogues like what we're having today, dialogues and collaboration between UN agencies, Red Cross movement, NGOs, academia, and governments. We also have the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, which seeks to bring partners form and leverage on investing and financing of the early actions. We also have the Anticipation Hub, which is a platform for technical assistance, sustained learning, and exchange on anticipatory action. And within East Africa, we have the East Africa focus-based financing technical working group, where we try to exchange knowledge and support each other to develop these particular systems. And in Kenya particularly, of course, we have the National Technical Working Group for Focus-Based Financing, where a number of us were in this call, including RCMRBs and members, and we try to work towards developing anticipatory system for floods and droughts. We are also trying to support government efforts to mainstream anticipatory action as part of the national, subnational DRM laws, policies, and frameworks. And currently, we've supported up to about 30 county governments to have their DRM laws either reviewed or developed, and to include aspects of anticipatory approach to disaster management, and more specifically to allocate funding for anticipatory action and establish structures that can sustain this, including the CMDRR, the community member disaster risk reduction committees. So, of course, the goal of all this mainstreaming is that we unite all these initiatives to make people livelihoods and development gains safer from disasters by scaling up anticipatory action. I'll give a quick example. Recently, there was a commitment from the G7 nations. The G7 Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Crisis Compact commits to avert the deterioration in the acute hunger worldwide and cap growth of humanitarian needs, including scaling up anticipatory action that has been prominently presented as a solution. And within the IFRC network, we are trying to also, we have the ambition of doubling our investment towards anticipatory action to over 100 million by 2025, 100 million CHF Swiss francs by 2025. But again, as much as a lot has been done, of course, there's more that can be done, and especially to ensure that we stay on the journey to having resilience, communities stay on the path. And one of the critical things that we need to do is to ensure that there's greater coordination is needed between disaster risk financing instruments, because now you can see we have one from UN OCHA, we have one from Start Network, one from FAO, the Red Cross Movement, WFP. Is it possible to create coordination between these funding instruments, both at global level as well as at the country level, so that we can support anticipatory risk management within this context? Of course, coordination is very critical in terms of developing risk thresholds. We cannot do it as our own. For example, Red Cross cannot do it as our own, and that's why we have a technical working group. We have to identify and develop these risk thresholds. We have to develop and agree on the triggers. We have to actually understand and agree on the risks and the impact we are prioritizing, so that we can be able to take and prioritize the right action. And that one happens between agencies and stakeholders ahead of a disaster. Of course, donors can be a major catalyst for change by requiring that the anticipatory action partners work together to avoid, of course, duplication of efforts, but also to increase the impact and the magnitude of the work we are doing. Also, it's important to know that to ensure that anticipatory action systems are not developing in isolation, and that messaging to the national government is very clear and unified. So as we present ourselves today from this forum, as we present ourselves to our government, we have to have unified information, unified stand, so that all this system that we're developing, all the work that we are doing, either as non-governmental organization, development partners, humanitarian organization, is actually anchored in the government structures, and the governments are taking leadership. It is important to enhance cross-sectoral partnership between academia, humanitarian and development organization, and the private sector. This is very critical because you cannot do it on your own. To be encouraged and supported to enable accessing the best science available. My previous speaker has presented a lot of the science they're doing in terms of the coral work, and we don't want as Kenya Red Cross to replicate that. So can we increase our partnership so that we can access the particular information that is coming from that side to be able to develop solutions for resilience building and, of course, anticipatory work. Of course, we need to increase sustainability and to strengthen the resilience of at-risk people who have the greatest vested interest in acting early by funding, by allocating funding to strengthen locally led initiatives. So as we work globally or think globally, we should actually try to strengthen and work locally and invest in the locally led interventions. Of course, we must stress that the funding for this system building, part of it should go to strengthening early warning of operational capacity and readiness to enable effective delivery of anticipatory action by local actors. So as much as the science of, the science is progressing in terms of climate science and forecasting and modeling and stuff like that, we have to ensure, of course, in terms of the early warning, in terms of the operational capacity, is also strengthened locally. Another important thing that we need to know is anticipatory action also represents an opportunity to put in practice what we've been talking about, the nexus, the humanitarian and development nexus, and ensure that the development investments are also protected and are shock responsive. Collective learning through joint monitoring and impact analysis in terms of what is happening is very important and should be prioritized so that we can increase the evidence, evidence around effectiveness of this particular way of working, which is the anticipatory way of working. We need to increase evidence so that we can advocate and get more people, convert those who are not yet converted. But more importantly, organization and government sometimes treat humanitarian development and climate as different issues, like they're distinct issues or phases of intervention. So I am doing climate change, or this is only about climate and it's not development, or I'm doing science and it's not development and stuff like that. So can we get away from that and put ourselves in the shoes of the affected communities that brought us here today, so that the silos between humanitarian development and climate sectors are not relevant or helpful. So I think for us, what is important for us is that we are able to deliver the needs of the most vulnerable population. They need to stay alive, they need to be protected, they need to anticipate and have the agency, be self-reliant, and more specifically, resilient to future shocks. Thank you, and back to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Dr. Halima, for your perspectives on the role of data and forecasts in anticipatory action. I think we have quite a few interesting questions coming through from the audience that we will address after the third panelist. Thank you again for your contributions. So we'd like to welcome back Mr. Mulongo from USAID Kenya, East Africa. We will run the slides from our side. Mr. Mulongo, can we do a quick sound check?
Yes, hello, you can hear me, Anderson?
We hear you loud and clear. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to apologize for connection issues, and actually it has just started raining in my neighborhood, and I was surprised it's raining with thunder and lightning, and this has not happened in Nairobi, I think, in a long time. So that's part of climate change. So I want to appreciate everyone for the opportunity for us to share on climate resilience development in water sector. And part of it has been spoken by Dr. Halima, and even David also touched on it. Yeah, but we will continue, and then I will focus on some of the activities that USAID is doing. So I will ask, I believe it's Anastasia who is moving the slide. So yes, thank you. So just a quick background. I think you've heard that when you hear that Kenya is 80% ASAL, arid and semi-arid, that means the majority, or as you see on that map, most of it, like 80% actually, the biggest chunk, it receives less than 500 millimeters of rain per year. And the biggest part, the greenish, the dark greenish one that receives more rain, which is 20%, is the one that accommodates more people. And so the country is classified as a water scarce country. So it has a per capita availability of water about 500 cubic meters against the UN recommended standard of 1,000. So the forest cover is now at 7%, which is a huge improvement. In the last 15 years, we had gone down to about 3%. So we are seeing, because we were actually going to the docks completely. And as you will know that especially the ASAL areas, the 80% that has less rainfall, they depend mostly on groundwater. And in most of these areas, when it rains maybe once in 2 years, and it rains within only 2 weeks. And so you hear that sometimes we have a lot drought, serious drought. Then within after some months, we have a lot of rain or lots of water, but that water disappears to the ocean within a short time. Yeah, so can we scroll the next, please? So looking at how we in the country Kenya did not just having that per capita availability of water of about 500. That's just in the recent years, but which has been a progression that has been happening for the last 50 years, and it's you will say inversely proportional. We are supposed to be maintaining, because in 1969 and 60s we had quite a good amount of water available for everybody, but now we have less. So we need to do something intentionally and drastically so as to reverse the situation. Can we go on? Next, please. So if you compare Kenya with the rest of Africa, you will see some countries, if a country is water scarce, you are in a scarcity place, you are less than 1,000 cubic meters. So if you are between 1,000 and about 1,800, you are in a stress position. So you are, if you are above 1,800 to up, you are in the vulnerable position. So some countries, they have actually, they have plenty of water. So when you look at Kenya, where the position of Kenya down there, it is it's like the third last in the in that chart. A situation that is it needs deliberate efforts to get us out of that position. Next, please. So you see, I think I've mentioned that you will see the rainfall pattern within the country, and actually the region has significantly changed over time. If you hear of El Nino, previously it used to have a return period of 10 years. Now we are talking of less, about 5 years. So we are seeing more when we have rain that is above normal. And I think Halima mentioned 2018, 2019, 2020, and that will show you briefly along the line. And the situation is becoming more and more unpredictable. So when you talk of drought, when you hear of drought happening, it means the water levels drop significantly, the boreholes or wells dry up, vegetation disappear. So when vegetation disappear, you know that pastoralist communities or people, they will not have access to water. Some of them in those areas walk to 5 to 10, 15 kilometers to just get 20-liter jerrycan for the family. So it puts a lot of stress and pressure on families, and particularly women and girls who are tasked with the duty of getting water to the households. Next, please. So in last year, this picture, this one is soil lodge. Those of you who know Kenya, where soil lodge is, last year we had serious rains that started all the way in December 2019 and went all the way to October, November 2020. Soil lodge is one of the tourist hotels in Baringo, and so you can imagine it's not just people being affected, businesses as well, jobs lost. And in that Baringo area, you can go to the next, please. Next slide. So okay, that's just those photos just shows the impact of what happened along in Lake Baringo. Yeah, okay, there. So this one, this photo shows an aerial, yes, satellite imagery of what showing how different lakes actually is happened in the course of last year. So the water levels increased significantly, the size increased, the communities that were living around the shores were displaced. They had to look for other places. In the previous photo, I think you could see some schools became submerged, and not just, even including wildlife. And so this means it's a lot of difficulties for communities. So Lake Baringo and Lake Bogoria, they are close to each other. So between them, we have a lake called Lake 94. It's actually a smaller lake. It actually disappeared. So can we go to the next, please? So these are briefly the numbers of different lakes along the Rift Valley, and how they were affected, how their water levels changed, and this was actually attributed to climate change. Yes, and the Lake Baringo actually increased more, like more than double. So you can imagine not just a displacement, but even the wildlife there. Or it means their normal areas, they had to migrate, move to other areas, maybe move to where people are, and that increases human-wildlife conflict. Next, please. Okay, so specifically when you are talking about now in Kenya, especially the water context, we look at especially availability of water for drinking. And so when this climate variabilities or events occur, it will mean we will have a problem or a challenge in people getting access. So at the moment we have about 40% of Kenyans who still do not have access to improved drinking water, just water for the basic drinking, let alone other things. And so when there is extreme events, it means they become more vulnerable. And we have about 30% of Kenyans who have access to improved sanitation. And of the urban centers in the whole of Kenya, those ones that are gazetted, it's only about 16% that have sewerage connection. So when there is a flooding, it means many who have pit latrines, they will fill up. So you can imagine the contamination. Is when there is a dry period, it means those who have shallow wells, they also dry. They start going to far places to get water. And in fact, World Bank has done an analysis and indicated that the country loses roughly $320 million annually due to poor sanitation. And this, you can imagine, in Kenya, we will be classifying this as 30 billion, which is equivalent to one thicker highway. We call it thicker superhighway. So that is the equivalent of loss that the country experience every year. And so, and this analysis was pre-COVID. So you can imagine now with COVID, even issues like disposal of those masks or the chemicals, they are adding more pressure even to the little available water. So for Kenya to meet the SDG and Vision 2030, we need about $1 billion in investment in the sector annually. But what is available collectively by the donors and the government is about 600 million. So we have a deficit of 40% every year. And so it's projected that if this trend continues, we will achieve SDG target by the year 2050, not 2030. So we need 20 more years. And so this one now, which means it basically means that we need to do something out of the ordinary. If you are projecting on a curve that is just moving up proportionally, you need to change the trend so that it goes up, so that you're able to meet the objective. Next, please. So I would want to mention that the government of Kenya, the host government, has done some taken some measures, especially in relation to water, with policy and the legal framework over the last 20 years. I'm sure every Kenyan who is here and those ones who were born before the year 90, you used to hear that by the year 2000, we will have a tap at every household. And when the year 2000 was approaching, it appeared this was not possible. So the government went to the drawing board and came up with a policy paper number 1, sessional paper number 1 of 1999, and which mandated, allow the government to change how the government does business. Because previously the government was doing everything. The policy was. Did I lose? Just a moment.
We can still hear you.
Okay. No, my screen went on. Yes, yes, I'm back. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that the government actually also adapted what the reforms that happened in the water sector, and I'm sure all of you know about the reform process, starting with the 1992 Rio de Janeiro Summit on Sustainable Development. Then we followed up the Dublin Principle, the Dublin Conference that later gave birth to Dublin Principles, and the Dublin Principles, which we emphasize on that water is finite. It should be used wisely because it will disappear. We need participatory approach in its development management, because everyone is involved. It's not just somebody else's. Everybody, all of us, including how you manage the water in your household. Those of you who have flush toilets, do you know it has 2 different switches? One is for small. When you go for a short call, you use the small switch so that you release only little amount of water. Then the bigger one is when you have gone for long call, so that we conserve the water. We need to be wise in using. Then water is an economic good. And also, finally, women play a key role in its management and development. They should not be left out because they are the principal. They really hold. They are the group that is affected most. So the government of Kenya developed the Water Act of 2002, which created separated functions, created water boards that licensed water companies, which were formerly local authorities, but now to operate on commercial basis. So in 2010, the country got a constitution, and this constitution now gave the rights to every Kenyan has a right to water and to basic access to basic water and sanitation. So when you talk of now Vision 2030 and now the devolution of the devolution space in the country that created subnational governments or entities, basically to make services closer to the people. And in this line, the issue of water service and sanitation service provision belongs to the county government, and the national government is tasked with the water resource management, because watersheds cut across counties or cut across different entities. So we got a new water bill of 2016 to align with the constitution, even though it has a lot of contentions between the national and the county governments. But we have other entities like Water Trust Fund and the regulator and the Water Resource Authority. Next, please. So for USAID work in Kenya, our work is driven by Water Earmark. Water Earmark is in the year 2005, the US Congress enacted a bill, what is called Paul Simon Water for the Poor Act. And this bill basically mandated the US government to set aside resources to help developing countries to achieve, to be able to access basic drinking water and have improved sanitation. So in the year 2014, that law was changed to Water for the World Act. And in 2017, the US government developed a whole of US government strategy, what is called the US Global Water Strategy. And it involves close to 17 agencies, you go whether USAID, NASA, USDA, USGS, all of them together. And that strategy is from 2017 to 2022. So next year, the US government will start working on another strategy for another 5 years. I was actually privileged to be among the few. I joined with a colleague from India who went to the US during the finalization, development and finalization of and the launch of that strategy in 2017. And so for us, we've seen a milestone as from the US government actually taking deliberate actions to contribute to the global community. So this strategy actually aims to have to make the world a secure place where people have access to enough water for human and economic ecosystems, while also taking cognizance and managing floods and droughts. So basically, we want to see a world with no diseases, where lives are saved and poverty is eradicated, and more so promote sustainable economic growth. So from that, the USAID Kenya developed now its own strategy, and our goal is to increase availability and of sustainable management of safe water and sanitation. Next, please. So that is the USAID global strategy. In a nutshell, it gives the governance and finance as top priority objective. Then it has an objective on sanitation access. Then it has an objective on drinking water, and then it has an objective on water resource management. Next, please. So this is our now result framework for the mission. So we want to have increased access to safe drinking water. We want to have access and use of sanitation and practice of key hygiene behaviors. And this is basically because I think the study was done and shown that it's only 5% of Kenyans practice hand washing with soap. And yet diarrhea is a big problem for the country. And yet if we have 60%, you would have expected that everybody has at least 60% are in that statistics of observing good hygiene behaviors. And so we want to see Kenyan behaviors changed, improved, and we will also want to see water resource managed well. Then we would like to see policies and necessary legislation in place. And more so, we want also to have more resources mobilized. And particularly, we want to look outside the traditional financing. We want to see, of course, the public financing from the exchequer increased, both at the national and the county government, but also even at also other private sector. We see banks giving loans to water companies so that they can increase, or to community groups so that they can make the resource available. Because Kenyans are very hardworking people, and so we believe that if you avail credit to them, they will make the systems work. So next, please. So for USAID, climate change is at the center of our work, and I'm sure you heard when the new administration came in place. I think President Biden, his first statement was that America is back. And we have returned to the Paris Accord. We want to see a USA desire to have a global world that is resilient, prosperous, equitable, with no emission. And We want prudent use of the available resources. And we look at, in innovations, focusing on efficiency and also scaling what is working. Next, please. So I want, this is just some of the programs that the mission has been having. This Kiwash activity or project has been ongoing since 2015. It looks at market approach. Yes, because we are trying to move away from traditional handout thinking to a new era market approach, which addresses the issues of sustainability. We want to address the challenges of financing and ensure that the resources are available, whether from donors or from banks or from private sector to support the sector. So we will want to see governance. You know, a lot of issues when you hear Nairobi or many of the urban centers in the country, they have a non-revenue water. This is basically water that is lost either through leakages of pipes but primarily others through theft and human negligence of up to 40%. Now it stands at 41%. Some of those urban centers have water losses of up to 60–70%. And so we want to have the different approach, efficiency in governance, improvement, wise use of the little resources that we have. Next. So this is Kenya Rapid. It's an activity that ended last September. And in developing this, we had a different approach whereby we looked at USAID combining with the private sector, and yes, to pull resources together to address the challenge, the challenge of water scarcity. And it enabled more than 460 people get access to water. And this activity was in northern Kenya, in Turkana, Marsabit, Wajir, Isiolo, and Garissa. And more so, we introduced new ideas because these areas, they are vast. Some of those water systems are in very remote areas and which have no access to power. So, and a number of them are running on diesel. So we want to see that they start working maybe on solar, which is more sustainable and more affordable. Of course, the initial cost of solar installation is up, but we also install water sensors that could monitor the borehole functionality if it's operating in that remote area. So the manager at a county headquarters is able to know if a certain borehole or water system is functioning or it's not functioning. And this one we merged together with a platform that was developed by IBM. And we're calling it WaterMasp, and to basically to improve the management of the water system. So actually this was very successful, and some of you could remember 2 years ago, I think 2019, around January, February, the city of Cape Town had a problem of water. There was not enough water in Cape Town. And actually, they approached the program, and Sweet Sense, who developed the IBM, yes, they went to help them actually using that program, sort out their water challenges. And back in the US, actually, the state of California has borrowed that technology to try and address the water challenge in the US. Next, please.
Mr. Malongo, just to make a note that we're running a bit short on time for Q&A. So if you would kindly summarize in the next minute.
Yes, I'm actually concluding. I think I have one or two. So this WashFin is basically trying to introduce financing, alternative source of funding into the sector. And this one, basically, we work with the banks and water companies to help them so that they can access financing from local banks. And we're seeing this is quite an alternative source of funding. Next, please. Okay, the next slide is about the water towers. We are working with the U.S. Forest Service and looking at assessing and just to get the right picture, and it's basically to have new way of doing business and ensure that communities in the 5 water tower areas of Kenya, the resources are managed well. So the result of this is that we did some assessments, we did some evaluation of some ecosystems, and we supported capacity building in climate change through sharing and of experience between the U.S. Forest Service and Kenya. And this basically, the 5 water towers, those are the resources, those are the foundation for the water for the country. Next, please. And finally, we are working with the USGS on water mapping, groundwater mapping. We started with the Turkana and Marsabit. The study has been ongoing for the last 4 years and is about to conclude. And we are discussing about a new site. Sorry, I couldn't use the maps that have been developed from this, but because the activity is almost being concluded, and the maps are going to be available to the public after official commissioning by the government of Kenya and the US government. So I think basically we have new activities that are upcoming, and I will want to finish at that because I can talk about for the whole day, but climate change and climate issues, they are the heart of our programming. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights, Mr. Mulongo, on WASH and the climate sector connections. We have around 15 minutes for Q&A, so I want to thank all of the attendees for sharing questions and answers, and the organizing committee for putting this Q&A together. I'll attempt to do an equitable job of addressing questions to all of the panelists. And if I could ask the panelists to keep their responses very to the point, maybe one or 2 minutes, so that we can address quite a few questions that have come in. So the first question is from Steve Ramage to David, and he thanks you for the talk, and is happy to hear that you're working with MBON already. And if you can follow the chat, I think Steve sent a link to you. He's interested, though, in the SDG interactions model. Do you build in Earth observations? And for some context, at their annual symposium, they're looking at a nexus approach, which builds on work done by the International Science Council. And it looks very similar to the model that you presented. It would be great to learn more. And so again, how do you build in Earth observations into this SDG interaction model?
Okay, thanks, Eric, for passing that on, and Steve for the question. So I've answered a little bit in the Q&A, in that we didn't look at the ISC model in developing ours, but I'm not surprised they're similar, because I think if you come through the SDGs in a considered way, we come to a similar approach. And I think that's the strength of the SDGs. Given my background in marine science, of course, I focused on coral reef ecological information, and then fisheries, as I presented in the one slide, and indicators around, a coral reef landscape. So we didn't consider Earth observation data, but I think from any discipline, you could bring in the indicators that can help support, parameterizing this SDG model for a particular context. And I think there'll be great richness in exploring how to do that. The last thing I'll say, just to be quick, is that we are working there's a 17 rooms initiative run by the Brookings Institute and Rockefeller Foundation. And in that, we're trying to develop, I guess a worksheets or a way to apply this SDG model in local contexts to help stakeholders come together and make common decisions on how to move forward on sustainability. So I'd be very glad to work with you more on that. Thanks, and other participants.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful response. I'd like to now direct a question towards to Dr. Halima from Tom, who's expressed fantastic insights. In your experience, what do you suggest can be done to help institutions, particularly governments, to take action based on predictive models? And then Tom expresses, in Kenya, for instance, the government was advised on drought and hunger in northern Kenya back in March or April, but it seems that only the cabinet secretary was acting. So Dr. Halima, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think I'll give maybe a personal opinion on that. From what we are seeing now is, if you look at how our policies are structured towards disaster management, we are more of a reactive institution, and it's very important for members to note that we don't even have a national DRM law, or we have a bill that was revised again in 2020, and now it's being worked on to be tabled to the parliament. So the current legislation that supports disaster management that we have in place is mainly on emergency. So the funds that are being allocated to response to disaster is actually on an emergency level. And that's why you'll see that the government comes in when we are getting into an emergency situation like right now. I think what we are trying to do, and I think most of us in this particular sector, is first to create, to gather evidence that actually using predictive modeling or anticipating something's coming and taking action in advance, it's of value, because people like to believe what they see, and if they see that this is working, they'll be able to undertake it. But more importantly, now we are anchoring all this in the disaster risk management law at the national level as well as at the county, because DRM is a devolved function. So we have some counties that have gone ahead, they have their laws with this kind of integration and allocated funding, and we are hoping these county governments will showcase that it's actually possible and important to use predictive modeling to take actions well in advance, especially leveraging on the forecast. So it's work in progress. We just need to gather evidence, speak about it, advocate it, make a lot of noise, if I may say, to be able to get this out there. So it's actually seeing is believing. So we need to showcase that actually it's going to work, or it's working.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful response. Before I pass it over to a question over to Dr. Mulungu, I'd like to stay on the thread of local and community involvement, and come back to David from Louis Kibe. So the question is to do away with the local community or not, or should we involve a community that is either part of the threat or part of, and I might add part of the solution. And Louis says, how do you change years of system framework failures and protection of the reefs?
Yeah, so interesting way to frame the question, I must say. I mean, and I also put that the shared earth or shared ocean model that we developed was explicitly to put local communities in the forefront and empower local communities in taking action. I think it's I think you'll get a lot of resistance to the idea of getting away with local communities. I mean, they are the stewards, or should be the stewards, can be the stewards, and in many cases could be that, but lack the resources and lack the backing from local government and governments to do the same. So I think we really need to invest in local solutions that put communities in the forefront for their own benefit, and then also more general benefit as well. Of course, it's very challenging to do that. It needs a lot of resources, it needs good governance, it needs extension systems. But I think, for example, Dr. Halima and the Red Cross work has shown how effective it can be when you really do empower communities and people, at the forefront in building resilience and addressing hazards. And that's, I think, one of the primary work that we have to do. And that lastly, with our growing, the rate at which Africa's population is growing, makes it even more challenging than it would be otherwise. So we really need to work out how to deal with this challenge as a priority, I think, in the coming decade to deliver on the SDGs and beyond that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great perspectives. Thank you. I would, and with our presentation from USAID Kenya East Africa perspectives from Mr. Mulongo, I mean, the wash sector is inherently a local issue, but there are also national and regional drivers and forces. I'm wondering, looking at the results framework, the ability to monitor progress or challenges, what data, either historic or monitoring or forecasting data, Mr. Mulongo, might be missing from the equation? And is there a role for people in this audience to make contributions towards WASH goals in light of climate change?
I believe that's not a question for me, Anderson.
So maybe if I can reframe the question, do you alluded to some data collection programs on, I believe, groundwater. Do you see that data, do you see any gaps in either data collection or information sharing that could help reach some of the WASH goals?
Yeah, of course, in Kenya, data issue. Even in groundwater mapping, for you to come up with accurate groundwater maps in Turkana Marsabit, you need accurate data on available boreholes, but you'll find a number of those boreholes, they do not have enough data. And that's what we are trying to improve on. But basically, this is going to improve the accuracy for even drilling boreholes from a success rate of 30% to about 95%. And we are going to see this one improve. But in terms of availability of data on in the health side, there is quite a lot of data in Kenya. The KDHS, they do have quite a data for spanning many years. And some of the watersheds, yes, they also do have some data, but it's not so much. So I think moving forward, data management is still a big issue, but we hope it will improve for the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that many of the attendees are eager to understand where their geospatial remote sensing work can contribute effectively to these goals. I'd like to, and I recognize that the audience is, the participants represent a diversity of non-governmental, governmental, public and private sector. So to Dr. Halima, is there room for more input from the private sector in the early warning systems that you're working on with the government of Kenya, the Met Department and other partners?
Yes, of course, there is room to private partners, and actually we are engaging with the private sector, not just from a financing perspective, because most of the time we look at the private sector from, are receiving and they are giving us money. But I think they have a lot to bring to the table. And at the Kenya Red Cross, we have an agreement with the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, where we have many private sector institutions into that alliance. And we look at them as disaster risk managers, because they have a role to manage the disasters or the risks that come with it, but they're also contributors. For example, if you look at, let's say, the construction industry in Kenya, if you look at how constructions are happening in Kenya, one or the other, they're one of the biggest or among the contributors of what we're experiencing in terms of increased impacts of, for example, in Nairobi of flooding. So we decided 2 years ago, I think 3 years ago, in 2018, I can't remember my counting very well, but in 2018, we got into partnership with the Kenya Private Sector Alliance because we believe they have a very big role in terms of considering them as disaster risk managers and not just as financiers. So yes, private sector has a very big role. We have Stanbic that is very interested in focus-based financing, and they're really interested in financing risks, especially for floods and drought. In Kenya, we also have Britam. I think Britam is international. They're also very keen in funding flood risks, work around flood risks. And of course, they come in terms of insurance. Insurance is very critical, and that's something that is upcoming and growing in terms of risk management, yes. So I think private sector do have a role. In the technical working group, yes, they're part of the technical working group.
Thank you very much, Dr. Halima. And maybe continuing the theme of private sector engagement, for Dr. Obura, we recognize that this research and these policy interventions are critical for making contributions to the blue carbon momentum. And so this is a question from Nashan Adero. They're interested in mangroves blue carbon as well as fighting climate change. And to extend on the question, could the root of blue carbon, coral reefs, mangroves, coastal and marine ecosystems be more deserving of policy priority than the usually elusive afforestation or reforestation targets, which face stiff competition from the expansion of monoculture farmlands with growing populations and urbanization? So over to you, Dr. Obura.
Okay, thank you. No, that's a great question to ask, and I think the simple answer is yes. Blue carbon ecosystems should be a very high priority for policy action, because they not only do they sequester a lot of carbon, but being right at the interface between land and sea, they're also extremely important ecosystems for other services as well. So mangroves and seagrasses, provide coastal protection. They also are nurseries for fish and very important habitats for fisheries. And so they provide multiple benefits. And blue carbon actually provides a mechanism to actually generate finance from reforestation and rehabilitation of these ecosystems. So that's very important. I think it's also important to realize that when RED came into focus and the possibility of carbon finance for reforesting or afforesting places, there was a rush to plant monocultures of fast-growing trees. And that's, of course, an inappropriate way to do that. And what needs to be done is to really promote natural and native vegetation that provides multiple benefits. And so not only will these provide climate benefits, but also multiple other benefits, both for nature and for people. So that's very much in the forefront of the current discussions on biodiversity. So I think we shouldn't discourage reforestation for carbon finance. We just need to make sure that it's done according to appropriate standards, and those are followed very, very closely. And there's good monitoring of those efforts.
Fantastic response and very, very thoughtful. Thank you. Well, we are just about out of time. I would like to thank the panelists again and summarize the session. It's very clear that Kenya, Eastern and Southern Africa is a leader in addressing climate mitigation challenges and climate opportunities and climate adaptation needs. From our USAID perspectives, from Mr. Mulongo, it's clear that in face of a dependence on groundwater and declining per capita water availability and threats of climate-induced flooding, there is vision for an action on Kenya water reforms. And it's clear that Kenya is learning and sharing its technology and its experience with other drought-prone areas, such as California in the Sweet Sense example. Dr. Halima from the Red Cross movement shared the growing threat of weather and climate-related disasters and how the humanitarian sector is using data and climate risk financing to get ahead of the impacts with effective actions. And our thanks again to our first presenter, Dr. Obura, who shared the various applications of remote sensing, GIS, and policy briefs to not only see the effects of climate change on coastal and marine ecosystems, but also providing policy insights on policies and programs. It's also very illuminating to see how one SDG supports the other from a global to local scale. Well, Well, thank you again to all of the presenters, to the attendees for their very thought-provoking questions. Thank you to RCMRD and the organizing committee. I will pass it back over to the organizers, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Eric, and everyone, all the panelists, and all the participants. We have the parallel sessions coming up shortly, so we will share those links, or you can go to the agenda and you'll find those links, and we look forward to seeing you there. And thereafter, we'll have the closing ceremony. So we also look forward to seeing all of you at the closing ceremony. Over from our side, and we wish you all the best. Good evening and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Bye.